Hello, everyone, and welcome back to the Writing Flock for another workshop. I'm your host, Madeline Jefferson, or Miss Writing Books. This week, our workshop is Writing Respectfully About Religion. So, religion is a major component to most people's lives, and it's important for your characters too. If your characters are one living in the contemporary world, they're going to be influenced by either a personal religious belief or their primary or main religion that surrounds them. And that could also include being secular or not. And there's really no avoiding religion as much as you think, oh, it's not important, my character isn't religious. Well, that doesn't really matter because there's still some sort of, even at that point, like personal internalized religion. What do they believe about life in the universe? And of course, the religious practices of the surrounding community is going to impact them. So it's important to make sure that you are, one, representing a religion accurately and also in a way that's not harmful, just the way you wouldn't want to stereotype somebody based on ethnicity. You don't want to stereotype somebody based on their religious belief or different components of a religion. And this is especially important if you're writing about religious beliefs and systems that are different from your own, whether they are completely different. Say you're Christian and you're wanting to write a character who maybe is not Christian, or if you're, say, a Protestant and you're wanting to write about a character who's Catholic, there are nuances there that would affect some of their behaviors or their beliefs or way they interact with the world. So this is why I've titled this workshop "Writing Respectfully About Religion." I will probably go on to do other religion-related workshops in the future for talking about, say, religion in the fantasy world, but this is mostly going to be relevant to anybody writing contemporary fiction or historical fiction too, anything set in the real world and using those religions, although you could also apply these things later, but again, that's a whole other workshop. I do just want to give some quick background on myself and where any of my authority might come from writing about this topic, talking to you about this topic. Of course, obviously, anything can be researched and then taught to you guys, but in this case, I actually have an undergraduate degree in comparative religion. I will say that in my degree, I primarily focused on the Abrahamic faiths, and even within that, a particular focus on the overlap between Christianity and Islam and also the mystic elements of both those religions. So that is where a lot of my examples for this will come from. That is also just my bias, what I know the best. But again, research is always your friend. And honestly, this whole workshop is really about researching and how you should research and what you should research and what you should know. Obviously, I can't give you a breakdown of all the religions in the world, their sects, their different variations. That would be a whole nother degree in itself. So this is just meant to be a leaping off point for you guys as you start a journey into writing these types of characters. Okay, so let's go ahead and jump into it. So here on your screen, you'll see some little charts kind of breaking down a general overview of the diversity of religion across the world, sort of what those percentages looks like. And you also see one that's a breakdown for U.S. percentages. I am based out of the U.S. A lot of times if I'm writing something contemporary, it will be based in the U.S. just because that's where I'm from. It's what I know. But you want to always look at your location, your setting. That matters. That impacts sort of whether or not, say, that religious belief of a character puts them in the minority or a majority in that area. And that's going to vary place to place. And even within the U.S., you go from, this is the large U.S. breakdown, but if you were to break down further into states and into cities, you're going to have different clusters of groups and ideas, just like in Utah and Salt Lake City, you have a larger percentage of Mormons than you are going to have in, say, Florida. Or in, like, Michigan, you might have in the greater expanse of Michigan, may not be as many, but if you get down into Dearborn, you're going to have a very large population of Muslims. It's just something you need to research and know about your characters. And it also kind of gives us an idea of sort of the breakdown of the world, and to remember that no religious belief is really as is not independent. There are differences of ideas everywhere, and you're going to be mixing, and how those groups mix is another way to look at how your characters interact. If you're looking at different conflicts in regions that are based on religion, or differences in even denominations or sects of religion. Looking at a chart like this too also shows you that while a group may be a majority population in one part of the world, in a whole other part of the world, they are an extremely small minority. Just as you see here, Muslims are 24.9% estimated of the whole world population, but in the US, they're just about 1%. So you should always just begin by looking at your setting and who your characters will be interacting with, and any prevalent issues around religious ideas in that area. Now, to get down into the 5 main areas I feel like you should be researching to write a religious character, the first one is going to be beliefs. Beliefs are, well, it's religion. That's what it's all about. What do they believe? What do they value, hold important? What is supposed to be, the idea, the point of life, things like that. So things you need to know and understand about the religion. Is it monotheistic, polytheistic, non-theistic? Who are the gods or goddesses or genderless entities, beings, things that have no true identity? Is there just is it energy? What's going on here? What are the stories, histories, and mythologies that make up the groundwork of these religions? Do they believe that there were important people in history, human teachers or prophets, who came and taught and instructed people on how to believe, how to behave, how to please a god or goddesses or the universe and all that? Is there an afterlife? What is the purpose of life on earth? Do you need to behave a certain way in order to make it into a paradise, or to behave badly and you're punished? Are you reincarnated? Is there some other kind of ether-like place that is not earth, but is not heaven, it's not a hell, it's not anything in those types of terms? Are there savior figures, messiahs? Oh, I just totally realized there's a typo, but we will go back and fix that for you guys. You're really here with beliefs, you're looking for the core ideas. These are usually, when people try to sum something up, like Christians they believe that, God begot a son, he came to earth, he died for our sins, was ascended and whatever. Then that would be the core kind of Christian belief. Or say you have in Islam, you have like their statement of faith, which is about the nature of the prophet and his what he did for people and all that. This is one of those places where it's very easy to get led astray and start stereotyping, but it's also one of the places you really need to know what you're talking about, or you're going to get it completely wrong. Especially if you get into nuances of minority groups, even within larger religion, going into smaller denominations, sects, or mystic cults. You get it wrong, or you get it wrong from one person's perspective. Obviously, people are going to pick up on that. And something with religion that's really important is this is not one of those things where you can make a boo-boo and get it wrong and nobody's going to notice it when they're reading your book or your story or poem or whatever it is. People will pick up on these things, and this is not a little thing that people will roll their eyes at when you mess up. It is something that will get people up in arms against you. So again, regardless of what you're doing with these types of characters in these situations, it is something you need to write towards with a high level of respect. Now, one of the best places to learn about what the core beliefs and values are is to look at the different traditions and texts, oral traditions. So that's the next place I suggest you do your research on. What are these texts and oral traditions? Or are there text or only oral traditions? Or did it begin as an oral tradition that became text? Most things began as oral traditions and were eventually written down. Do these groups have official, finalized versions that are accepted or not accepted? Depending on what kind of character and setting or even, smaller breakdown of a religion you might get into, whether or not certain things are accepted by all groups may be important, or whether or not different groups who use the same source material may be interpreted the same way, because, well, nothing is ever always interpreted the same way, person to person or group to group. So you want to look at how is the religion or these beliefs recorded and taught, how was it spread, the significance of text or books or recitations, storytelling, what is the importance of all these things? You're going to be looking at things that are like books and scrolls, the language it was written or performed in, the format, style, who wrote it, are there multiple authors, is music a major way that these things are recorded and told? This is really, another area that can be really interesting. The idea of written versus a storytelling versus a song versus poetry or not being poetry, even if it has a lyrical sound to it. What does that mean? Is it important or significant in that religion to memorize and be able to recite things perfectly? What are the issues about the development and the preservation of these texts over time, or these traditions over time? Is there problems or issues, with translation? Most things are not written, at least for the majority of our religion traditions today, were not written in modern day languages. So they've been, one, translated through the way language develops over time for the languages that are still used. But they've also been oftentimes translated from one language to another, sometimes 3 times, before maybe getting to the final, version that many people might be referencing or that you might be referencing and using. And how does that affect its interpretation, its authority? These are all issues you see a lot of when you're talking about, say, the Abrahamic faith. Again, guys, I will be making majority references to Abrahamic faith. That's Judaism, Christianity, Islam, just because that is where the majority of my knowledge stems from. But things like the languages that these texts were written in, which they started in oral traditions, they were preserved as texts, and all that. These are, in this case, very important. Jewish people and Christians use some of the same bodies of text, but the interpretation and the way it is studied and spread is quite different. There's a whole tradition for reading what's often now called the Hebrew Bible that is not necessarily used by Christians the same way. So you'll see Christians interpreting texts differently from, say, Jewish scholars because of just different methodologies of approaching it and different acceptances and histories of what is the understood interpretation of a text. The language that these were written in, ancient languages that, with the New Testament written majority in Aramaic and Greek, most of the consistent translations we're using now have not been translated directly from that original Aramaic or Greek to modern English, for instance. And then you have things like the King James version of the Bible versus its other standardized translations, which are very different and even take out different things. There's, personally, I find it funny, there's a little section in John, the Gospel of John, that only makes sense in the way it was written in Greek, and it's supposed to be a quote from Jesus, and while Jesus spoke Aramaic, he wouldn't have spoke Greek, and so it's a pun that would not have made sense in the original language. So it's one of those things that, while it claims to be a quote, is more likely, the spirit of what might have been said, really. And, you get into, say, Islam, and you're talking about the Quran, what isn't accepted. if it is a translation, if it is not the original Arabic, it is not the Quran. It is a translation of the message of the Quran. There is a very strict understanding placed there because there's this concern about preserving original intent and meaning in the words and how that can be lost when you're moving back and forth. And I'm trying not to get too far into the weeds here, guys. I know this is, again, a lot of what I would encourage you to be researching yourself, and these are just the kinds of things to be thinking about, because they impact, the character's understanding, their interactions with people, these types of things. And again, something like, say, music, especially in the Christian tradition, what are the roles of hymns or psalms? Where do they play? And that can really vary from different groups. If you're talking about, like, say, an African American tradition, Christian group, the role of music can be very important and be much, honestly, in some regards, much more important than it might be in a more white Christian group, just because of the history of hymns used in times during enslavement for spreading things, but also for the way that has just kind of impacted their general culture and relationship with Christianity. And honestly, looking at some of the ways that traditions that might have come with enslaved people from their original cultures then intermixed with the enforced and colonization of Christianity upon them can be really interesting as well. But it's also, I say interesting, but again, I'm a religion scholarship nerd. It's my thing. But it impacts, their relationship and how things are interpreted. I mean, the difference you might see between an African American versus African versus, an American white person's interpretation of the same text can be vastly different because, again, culture, experiences, all that. So that's, again, where you get back to that issue of location and general population around them as you look at an impact of something like that. Okay, when you understand sort of the background, something you want to look at is, what do people do? How do they perform their religion? How do they, what is going on? Do they go to church? Do they have different rituals? What does prayer look like? What are their religious holidays? Are there rites of passage that come with certain ages, like a bat mitzvah that happens for coming of age? Is there sacrifice involved? Has that changed with history? That changes sometimes for some of these groups. Are there things that go with, like, cleansing and clearing a space, making it, or the person? There are things that might go into cleansing a person versus cleansing a space, or there might be both. Is pilgrimage a thing? Are there certain places people need to go or want to go, whether it's required by the religion itself or is just an external, like, secondary thing? Like, a lot of pilgrimages, you say, for, like, Christians are, honestly, they're not required, but there is a pilgrimage that is required of Muslims. What do they do to celebrate or mark the time when someone dies or when someone is born? Are there requirements for showing mourning? Are there special requirements in rituals that happen with conversion when somebody transitions from one religion to another? What about food? Are there certain things they need to do to make a food acceptable to eat, or foods that they eat on certain occasions for certain rituals, things like communion or the different, oh gosh, this is me gonna blank on it. Give me just 1 second. I gotta double check this. Sorry, I was trying to remind myself. It's the bitter herbs or bitter greens that are eaten in Jewish households during Passover, things like that, or how things might need to be slaughtered in a certain way in order to be considered halal when you're talking about Islam, or kosher when you're talking about Judaism, things like that. How do people perform their religion? What do they do? This is about their actions that's what it is to be a ritual. And sort of on the same line as what do people do, what do they not do, or what are things that they are not allowed to do? This you see this a lot when you're talking about things like in Judaism or in Islam. You talk about, like, food laws, what is kosher, what is halal, things like that. But there's oftentimes more than that. But food is in one of the major places you see that. Again, kosher, halal, what are things you can or not eat. In kosher, you're not going to eat like bottom feeders, shrimp, things like that. In both things that are kosher and halal, you're not going to eat blood. You don't eat carrion, which is, dead things, which, I mean, yes, you eat dead things, but, like, you're not going to eat something that's dead and rotting, that type of thing. You're going to eat meat that you slaughtered or caught. And, of course, that has, its own rules. Are there rules about medicine? There are, certain groups that, such as Jehovah's Witnesses, they're not going to be wanting things like blood transfusions, and that can also then tie into things with sex and reproduction, whether or not they are okay with things like birth control, or if there are only certain types of birth control that are allowed. Physical contact, that can be between anybody, between different genders. Is it okay to a certain age to interact physically with people? Is it not? The consumption of drugs or anything that might be intoxicating, that could be alcohol. Some might even consider that caffeine when you're looking at some groups. And with that too, is it because it is a drug, because it's not good for you, or is there some sort of limitation? Is it okay to consume something up to a point? And like, what is the issue? Like, there's an interesting debate, say, in Islam about alcohol. It's not so much, it's really more in some smaller Sufi groups, which are mystics, about whether or not it's all alcohol is the issue or all substances is the issue of that kind of consumption, or if the issue becomes what makes the point that makes you intoxicated and then not in full control of your faculties, where you could behave in more immorally or things like that. Things like magic and divination, are there allowable things that might be called magic or divination, or are there things that are not allowed? You see this issue, with Christianity. Oh, it's witchcraft. You can't read tarot cards or throw bones, things like that. Well, at the same time, for many pagan groups, that is a important part of what they do and how they practice. Although you can even, when you talk about divination, there's also that line of, well, is prophesying, what is that? Is that divination? Is it not? And how different groups might interpret it. And also, like modern day prophecy, has a time of prophecy past? Is prophecy something that still goes on? That's also another interesting division you might find between African American or Black churches versus white churches. Some of that is a little different, and what they use that word for, like what they might mean by prophesying versus like divination, is not necessarily the same. Or you can also have taboos on body modification. Should you change what has been created in theory or in practice, by God, that was made in a certain way, especially when we talk about Abrahamic faith, like this was made in a certain image of God. Do you modify that? Whereas in other groups, body modification through piercing and tattoos, that is an expression of their religious devotion. And again, this is something that can even vary from different groups within a religious order. Things that might be see it as less of a problem to tattoo your skin. Some more modern day churches, Christian churches, are not as opposed to it, whereas some more conservative and traditionalist churches might be. But the things people don't do or are forbidden are really just as telling as the things that they do. And then this kind of discussion of body modification gets us into my last point of talking about expression. How do people express like their religious faith in a kind of physical or a way that lets you identify them or not identify them? So something that might be a way to identify someone of a particular faith, might be their clothing. Are they, and this is also somewhat, depending on what you're talking about, can also be a cultural clue to some characters when you're talking about ethnic clothing, especially when you're talking about in the situation of, say, in the U.S., where we typically see people dress a certain way, and if they're not, they stand out, whether it's from wearing something. I'm losing my train of thought. like a keffiyeh or hijab, those kinds of things. When you're talking about veiling too, that's another form of clothing. Those stand out because that's one is a cultural identifier, it's a religious identifier. How somebody may wear their hair, again, with veiling too, is like, do they cover their hair or not? Veiling, can be like fabric that is fully wrapped around the hair, and that can look a dozen different ways. And of course, those might have different names too, from one religion to another, and different cultures to another, even within the same religion, might have different ways of expressing that. In Judaism, you even see a form of veiling that doesn't immediately read as veiling to anybody who doesn't know to look for something, because sometimes women will wear wigs. And that is still a form of veiling, because the idea is they are still covering their natural hair. They're just doing it with a wig, and it may not be super obvious to outsiders or people who wouldn't recognize a wig, which I can't. But that's just me. Things like jewelry or even amulets and talismans are another identifiers. If you're wearing, say, like a cross necklace, as much as you might not like the word, it is technically that's an amulet or a talisman to be wearing that. If you're wearing like a cross to represent that you're Christian or that you fall under the protection of God, or you're asking for, that kind of protection, that is still technically an amulet or talisman when you're looking at what the definition of those words are. Phrases that people might use when they're speaking, it's another interesting one where you can see the impact of a certain religious belief on people who may not even believe that. In the U.S., you might, which is a majority Christian country to secular as well, but you'll hear things like, oh my God, or under God, in the name of God, in all these situations that are not inherently religious, but they're influenced by the Christian belief system. And so you'll see things like that everywhere, and that might impact somebody who speaks it. Same thing even with other languages. Somebody who's from that same culture might use some of the same phrases that are traditionally maybe religious in origin, but are not being used for that reason. Or especially when you're talking about, say, if you were, say, in the Middle East and you heard somebody say, there are certain phrases that to a Western ear, we immediately go, oh, that person might be Muslim. Well, at the same time, it could also very easily be somebody who is Christian who also happens to speak something like Arabic, because the words, especially because they're related religions, the words are the same. Like, inshallah, God willing, that is, yes, typically we would hear that and expect the person to be Muslim, but someone who's also Christian and speaks Arabic, it's just as likely to say something like that. But really, all these are things that are just meant to be a starting point. Like I said, I can't go super in depth into every religion that's out there and their ideas and their belief systems. One, I don't have the expertise to do that. But two, it's just, we don't have time for that. These are really just meant to be a place for you guys to start jumping off and doing your own research to make sure that you can write about these religious ideas and these religions in ways that is respectful and accurate and isn't going to be harmful either to that population or to an individual in any way you can, or really create characters that are not putting forward a more understanding life. But if you guys have questions or feel like we need to go into some of these things more in depth, please let us know. Leave a comment, like and subscribe, and stay tuned for more workshops from the Writing Flock. Have a good night.